CHAPTER XIV of Love Among the Artists by George Bernard Shaw. This Librivox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Expatriate in Bangor, Maine. CHAPTER XIV Later in the afternoon Conolly asked permission to visit the farm, and inquired whether there was any running water in the neighborhood. Sir John proposed to accompany him, but he declined, on the ground that a prospecting engineer was the worst of bad company. When he was gone, Lady Geraldine's bosom heaved with relief. She recovered her spirits, and presently followed Sir John to the library, where they had a long conversation together. Having concluded it to her satisfaction, she was leaving the room when Sir John, who was seated at a writing table, coughed and said mildly, My dear." Lady Geraldine closed the door again, and turned to listen. I was thinking, as we came down together," said Sir John slowly, smiling and combing his beard with his fingers, that perhaps he might take a fancy that way." Who?" Conolly, my dear." Stuff!" said Lady Geraldine sharply. Sir John smiled in deprecation. At least," she added, repenting, I mean that he is married already." But he is free to marry again." Besides, he is not a gentleman." Well," said Sir John good humoredly, I think we agreed just now that that did not matter." Yes, in Hoskyn's case." Just so. Now Conolly is a man of greater culture than Hoskyn. Of course it is only a notion of mine; and I dare say you are quite right if you disapprove of it. But since Mary is a girl with nice tastes, for art and so forth, I thought that perhaps she might not suit a thorough man of business. Hoskyn is only an Americanized commercial traveller." Conolly is an American too; but that has nothing to do with it. Conolly treated his wife badly: that is enough for me. I am certain he would make any woman miserable." If he really did " But, dear," interrupted Lady Geraldine, with restrained impatience, don't you know he did? Everybody knows it." Sir John shrugged himself placidly. They say so," he said. I am afraid he was not all that he should have been to her. She was a charming creature, great beauty, and I thought great rectitude. Dear me, you were right as usual, Joldie. It would not suit." Lady Geraldine left the library, and went to dress for dinner, disturbed by the possibility which Sir John had suggested. At dinner she watched Conolly, and observed that he conversed chiefly with Mary, and seemed to know more than she on all her favorite subjects. Afterwards, when they were in the drawing room, Mary asked him whether he played the piano. As he replied in the affirmative, Lady Geraldine was compelled to ask him to favor her with a performance. At their request, he played some of Jack's music, much more calmly and accurately than Jack himself played it. Then he made Mary sing, and was struck by her declamatory style, which jarred Lady Geraldine's nerves nearly as much as it had Mrs. Phipson's. He next sang himself, Mary accompanying him, and at first soothed Lady Geraldine by his rich baritone voice, and then roused her suspicions by singing a serenade with great expression, which she privately set down as a cold blooded hypocrisy on his part. She at last persuaded herself that he was deliberately trying to engage the affections of Mary, with the intention of making her his second wife. Afterwards he went out with Sir John, who often smoked cigars after dinner in the portico, and was fond of having a companion on such occasions. Thank goodness," said Lady Geraldine. Bluebeard has gone, and we can have our chat at last." Why Bluebeard?" said Mary, laughing. His beard is auburn. Has he been married more than once?" No; but mark my words, he will marry at least half a dozen times; and he will kill all his wives, unless they run away from him, as poor Marian did. However, so long as he does not marry us, he can do as he likes. The question of the day is, what are you going to say to Mr. John Hoskyn?" Oh," said Mary, her face clouding, let Mr. John Hoskyn wait. I wish he were in America." And why?" said Lady Geraldine in an obstinate tone. Because I want to enjoy my visit here, and not be worried by his proposals." You can answer him in 5 minutes, and then enjoy your visit as much as if he actually were in America." That is true, except that it will take much longer than 5 minutes to devise a letter that will not hurt his feelings too much." I could write a sensible letter for you that would not hurt his feelings at all." Will you? I shall be so much obliged. I hate refusing people." Mary: I hope you are not going to be foolish about this offer." Do you mean," said Mary, astonished, that you advise me to accept it?" Most decidedly." But you said last night that he was not even a gentleman." Oh, a gentleman! Nonsense! What is a gentleman? Who is a gentleman nowadays? Is Mr. Conolly, with whom you seem so well pleased," Mary opened her eyes widely, a gentleman, or Mr. Jack?" Do you not consider Mr. Herbert a gentleman?" Yes, I grant you that. I forgot him. But I only conclude from your experience of him that a mere gentleman would not do for you at all. Do you dislike Mr. Hoskyn?" No. But then I do not absolutely dislike any man; and I know nearly 100." Is there anyone whom you like better?" No. Of course I am speaking only of people whom I could marry. Still, that is not saying much. If I heard that he was leaving the country forever, I should be rather relieved than otherwise." Yes, my dear. I know it is very annoying to be forced to make up one's mind; but you will gain nothing by putting it off. I have been speaking to Sir John about Mr. Hoskyn; and everything he has told me is satisfactory in the highest degree." I am sure of it. Respectable, well off, rising, devotedly attached to me, calculates his figures at a percentage off the minimum, and so forth." Mary," said Lady Geraldine gravely: have I mentioned even one of those points to you?" No," said Mary, taken a little aback. But what other light can you see him in?" In the best of all lights, that of a comfortable husband. I am in dread for you lest your notions of high art should make you do something foolish. When you have had as much experience as I, you will know that genius no more qualifies a man to be a husband than good looks, or fine manners, or noble birth, or anything else out of a story book. But want of genius is still less a qualification. Genius, Mary, is a positive disqualification. Geniuses are morbid, intolerant, easily offended, sleeplessly self‐conscious men who expect their wives to be angels with no further business in life than to pet and worship their husbands. Even at the best they are not comfortable men to live with; and a perfect husband is one who is perfectly comfortable to live with. Look at the matter practically. Do you suppose, you foolish child, that I am a bit less happy because Sir John does not know a Raphael from a Redgrave, and would accept the Last Waltz cheerfully as a genuine something or other by Bach in B minor? Our tastes are quite different; and, to confess the truth, I was no more romantically in love with him when we were married than you are at present with Mr. Hoskyn. Yet where will you find such a modern Darby and Joan as we are? You hear Belle Saunders complaining that she has nothing in common with her husband. What cant! As if any two beings living in the same world must not have more things in common than not, especially a husband and wife living in the same house, on the same income, and owning the same children. Why, I have something in common with Macalister, the gardener. I can find you a warning as well as an example. I knew Mr. Conolly's wife very well before she was married. She was a woman of whom it was impossible to believe anything bad. In an evil hour she met Conolly at a charity concert where they had both promised to sing. Of course he sang as if he was all softness and gentleness, much as he did just now, probably. Then there was a charming romance. She, like you, was fond of books, pictures, and music. He knew all about them. She was very honest and candid; he a statue of probity. He was a genius too, and his fame was a novelty then: everybody talked of him. Never was there such an auspicious match. She was the only woman in England worthy of him; he the only man worthy of her. Well, she married him in spite of the patent fact that, with all his genius, he is a most uncomfortable person. She endured him for 2 years, and then ran away with an arrogant blockhead who had nothing to recommend him to her except an imposing appearance and an extreme unlikeness to her husband. She has never been heard of since. If she had married a domestic man like Hoskyn, she would have been a happy wife and mother to day. But she was like you. She thought that taking a husband was the same as engaging a gentleman to talk art criticism with. I think I had better advertise, wanted, a comfortable husband. Applicants need not be handsome, as the lady is short sighted." Sounds very prosaic, Lady Geraldine." It is prosaic. I told you once before that the world is not a stage for you to play the heroine on. Like all young people, you want an exalted motive for every step you take." I confess I do. However, you have forgotten to apply your argument to Mr. Hoskyn's case. If people with artistic tastes are all uncomfortable, I must be uncomfortable; and that is not fair to him." No matter: he is in love with you. Besides, you are not artistic enough to be uncomfortable. You have been your father's housekeeper too long." And you really advise me to marry Mr. Hoskyn?" Lady Geraldine hesitated. I think you can hardly expect me to take the responsibility of directly advising you to marry any man. It is one of the things that people must do for themselves. But I certainly advise you not to be deterred from marrying him by any supposed incompatibility in your tastes, or by his not being a man of genius." I wonder, would Mr. Conolly marry me?" Marry!" It was an unmaidenly remark," said Mary, laughing. It is undignified for a sensible girl to play at being silly, Mary. I hope you have no serious intention beneath your jesting. If you have, I shall be very sorry indeed for having allowed Mr. Conolly to meet you here." Not the slightest, I assure you. Why, Lady Geraldine, you look quite alarmed." I do not trust Mr. Conolly much. Marian Lind was infatuated by him; and another woman may share her fate, unless she happens to share my feeling towards him, in which case she may be regarded as perfectly safe. He is a dangerous subject. Let us leave him, and come back to our main business. Is Mr. Hoskyn to be made happy or not?" I don't want to marry at all. Let him have Miss Cairns: she would suit him exactly." Well, if you don't want to marry at all, my dear, there is an end of it. I have said all I can. You must decide for yourself." Mary, perceiving that Lady Geraldine felt offended, was about to make a soothing speech, when she heard a chair move, and looking up, saw that Conolly was in the room. Do I disturb you?" he said. Not at all," said Lady Geraldine with dignity, looking at him rather severely, and wondering how long he had been there. We were discussing sociology," said Mary. Ah," said he serenely. And have you arrived at any important generalizations?" Most important ones." What about, if I may ask?" About marriage." Lady Geraldine stamped hastily on Mary's foot, and looked reproachfully at her. Mary felt her color deepen; but she faced him boldly. And have you come to the usual conclusions?" he said, sitting down near them. What are the usual conclusions?" said Mary. That marriage is a mistake; that men who surrender their liberty, and women who surrender their independence, are fools; that children are a nuisance; and so forth." We have not come to any such conclusions. We rather started in with the assumption that marriage is a necessary evil, and were debating how to make the best of it." On which point you differed, of course." Why of course?" Because Lady Geraldine is married and you are not. Can I help you to arrive at a compromise? I am peculiarly fitted for the task because I am not married, and yet I have been married." Lady Geraldine, who had turned her chair so as to avert her face from him, looked round. Disregarding this mute protest, he continued, addressing Mary. Will you tell me the point at issue?" It is not so very important," said Mary, a little confused. We were only exchanging a few casual remarks. A question arose as to whether the best men make the best husbands. I mean the cleverest men — men of genius, for instance. Lady Geraldine said no. She maintains that a good natured blockhead makes a far better husband than a Caesar or a Shakespeare." Did you say that?" said Conolly to Lady Geraldine with a smile. No," she replied, almost uncivilly. Blockheads are never good natured. At best they are only lazy. I said that a man might be a very good husband without any special culture in the arts and sciences. Mary seemed to think that any person who understands as much of painting as an artist is a person who sympathizes with that artist, and therefore a suitable match for her or him. I disagree with her. I believe that community of taste for art has just as much to do with matrimonial happiness as community of taste for geography or roast mutton, and no more." And no more," repeated Conolly. You are quite right. Heroes are ill adapted to domestic purposes. That is what you mean, is it not? Perhaps Miss Sutherland will be content with nothing less than a hero." No," said Mary. But I will never admit that a man is not the better for being a hero. According to you, he is the worse. I heartily despise a woman who marries a fool in order that she may be comfortably despotic in her own house. I do not make absolute heroism an indispensable condition. I do not know exactly what heroism means. But I think a man may reasonably be expected to be free from vulgar prejudices against the efforts of artists to make life beautiful, and to have so disciplined himself that his wife can always depend on his self control and moral rectitude. It must be terrible to live in constant dread of childish explosions of temper from one's husband, or to fear at every crisis that he will not act like a man of sense and honor." Conolly looked at her curiously, and then, with an intent deliberation which gave the fullest emphasis to his words, leaned a little towards her with his hands on his knees, and said: "Did you ever live with a person whose temper was imperturbable, who never hesitated to apply his principles, and never swerved from acting as they dictated? One who, whatever he might be to himself, was to you so void of the petty jealousies, irritabilities, and superstitions of ordinary men, that as far as you understood his view of life, you could calculate upon his correct behavior beforehand in every crisis with as much certainty as upon the striking of a clock?" "No," said Lady Geraldine emphatically, before Mary could reply. "And I should not like to, either." "You are always right," said Conolly. "Yet such a person would fulfil Miss Sutherland's conditions. Like Hamlet," he continued, turning to Mary, "you want a man that is not passion's slave. I hope you may never get him; for I assure you, you will not like him. He would make an excellent god, but a most unpleasant man, and an unbearable husband. What could you be to a wholly self sufficient man? Affection would be a superfluity with which you would be ashamed to trouble him. I once knew a lady whom I thought the most beautiful, the most accomplished, and the most honest of her sex. This lady met a man who had learned to stand alone in the world, a hard lesson, but one that is relentlessly forced on every sensitive but unlovable boy who has his own way to make, and who knows that, outside himself, there is no God to help him. This man had realized all that is humanly possible in your ideal of a self disciplined man. The lady was young, and, unlike Lady Geraldine, not wise. Instead of avoiding his imperturbable self sufficiency, she admired it, loved it, and married it. She found in her husband all that you demand. She never had reason to dread his temper or to doubt his sense and honor. He needed no petting, no counsel, no support. He had no vulgar prejudices against art, and indeed was fonder of it than she was. What she felt about him I can only conjecture; but I know that she ceased to love him, whilst around her thousands of wives were clinging fondly to husbands who bullied and beat them, to fools, savages, drunkards, knaves, passion slaves of many patterns, but all weak enough to need caresses and forgiveness occasionally. Eventually she left him. And it served him right; for this model husband, who had never forfeited his wife's esteem, or tried her forbearance by word or deed, had led her to believe that he would be as happy without her as with her. A man who is complete in himself needs no wife. If you value your happiness, seek for someone who needs you, who begs for you, and who, because loneliness is death to him, will never cease to need you. Have I made myself clear?" "Yes," said Mary. "I think I understand, though I do not say I agree." Sir John came in just then, opportunely enough; and he found Conolly quite willing to talk about the projects of the company, although the ladies were thereby excluded from any part or interest in the conversation. Mary took the opportunity to slip away, unnoticed save by her hostess. When Conolly's attention was released by Sir John going to the library for some papers, he found himself alone with Lady Geraldine. "Mr. Conolly," said Lady Geraldine, overcoming with obvious effort her reluctance to speak to him, "although you were of course not aware of it, you chose a most unfortunate moment for explaining your views to Miss Sutherland. There are circumstances which render it very undesirable that her judgment should be biased against marriage just at present." "I hardly follow you," said Conolly, with a benignant self possession which made Lady Geraldine privately quail. "Are you opposed to the suit of Mr. Hoskyn?" She looked at him in consternation. "I see you are surprised by my knowledge of Miss Sutherland's affairs," he continued. "But that only convinces me that you do not know Mr. Hoskyn. In business matters he can sometimes keep a secret. In personal matters he is indiscretion personified. Everybody in Queen Victoria Street, from the messenger to the chairman, is informed of the state of his affections." "But why, if you knew this, did you talk as you did?" "Because," said he, smiling at her impatience, I did not then know that you disapproved of his proposal." Mr. Conolly," said Lady Geraldine, trying to speak politely: I don't disapprove of it." Then we are somehow at cross purposes. I, too, approve; and as Hoskyn is not, to my knowledge, likely to be a hero in the eyes of a young lady of Miss Sutherland's culture, I ventured to warn her that he might be all the better qualified to make her happy." I told her so myself. But if you want to encourage a young girl to marry, surely it is not a very judicious thing to give such a bad account of your own married life." Of my own married life?" I mean," said Lady Geraldine, coloring deeply, of your own experience of married life — what you have observed in others." She stopped, feeling that this was a paltry evasion, and added, I beg your pardon. I fear I have made a very painful blunder." No. An allusion to my marriage — from you — does not pain me. I know your sympathies are not with me; and I am pleased to think that they are therefore where they are most needed and deserved. As to Miss Sutherland, I do not think that what I said will have the effect you fear. In any case, my words are beyond recall. If she refuses Mr. Hoskyn, I shall bear the blame. If she accepts him, I will claim to have been your ally." She would be angry if she knew that you were aware, all the time you were talking, of her position." Angry with me, yes. That does not matter. But if she knew that Mr. Hoskyn had told me, she would be angry with him; and that would matter very much." Before Lady Geraldine could reply, her husband returned; and Conolly withdrew shortly afterwards for the night. Next day, Mary received from Hoskyn a second letter begging her to postpone her answer until he had seen her, as he had now become convinced that such matters ought to be conducted personally instead of by writing. As soon as he had ascertained which hotel was the nearest to Sir John's house, he would, he wrote, put up there, and asked Mary to contrive one long interview. She was not to mention his presence to Lady Geraldine, lest she should think he expected to be asked on a visit. Mary immediately made Lady Geraldine promise that he should not be asked on a visit, and then, to avoid the threatened interview, made up her mind, and wrote to him as follows: Dear Mr. Hoskyn, I shall not give you the trouble of coming down here to urge what you so frankly proposed in your first letter. I trust it will relieve your anxiety to learn that I have decided to accept your offer. However, as the position we are now in is one that we could not properly maintain whilst visiting at the house of a friend, I beg that you will give up all idea of seeing me until I leave Devonshire. My social duties here are so heavy that I can hardly, without seeming rude, absent myself to write a long letter. I suppose you will go back to Trouville until we all return to London. I am, dear Mr. Hoskyn, yours sincerely, Mary Sutherland. Mary composed this letter with difficulty, and submitted it to Lady Geraldine, who said, It is not very loving. That about your social duties is a fib; and you want him to go to Trouville because he cannot write so often." I can do no better," said Mary. But you are right. I will burn it and write him another, refusing him point blank. That will be the shortest." No, thank you. This will do very well." And Lady Geraldine closed it with her own hands, and sent it to the post. Later in the afternoon, Mary said, I am exceedingly sorry I sent that letter. I have found out my real mind about Mr. Hoskyn at last. I detest him." Lady Geraldine only laughed at her. CHAPTER XV. Expatriate in Bangor, Maine.